Hey guys, this is David Payton from New York. Welcome to Boring History Documentary. Tonight, we are stepping into a part of medieval life that most grand history tends to leave quietly at the edge of the frame. Castles, monasteries, market towns, manor houses, pilgrim roads, wool blankets, straw mattresses, oak chests, church benches, winter cloaks, all of them belong to the familiar picture. But there is another detail, smaller and far less noble, that followed people almost everywhere. Fleas were not simply an occasional nuisance. In much of medieval Europe, they were part of the background conditions of life. And the more closely we look, the more revealing that becomes. Because this is not only a story about discomfort. It is also a story about housing, hygiene, animals, clothing, class, medicine, belief, and the quiet limits of what people could control. That is one of the reasons this subject is more layered than it first sounds. It is easy to imagine fleas as a sign of carelessness, or to treat them as a minor comic detail from the past. But the medieval world was not dirty in some simple or uniform way, and its people were not ignorant of bodily discomfort. They noticed it, named it, tried to manage it, and lived with it in ways that tell us a great deal about daily existence. If you enjoy calm, thoughtful, long-form history that takes ordinary details seriously, this is exactly the kind of deep dive this channel is made for, so do subscribe if that sounds like your sort of evening viewing. And if you'd like to support the channel in a simple way, a like on the video really does help more people find careful history told at a gentler pace. As always, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what time it is where you are, and what history topic you'd like us to explore next. To begin, it helps to set aside the modern expectation that a home should be sealed, climate-controlled, frequently laundered, and sharply divided from the animal world. Most medieval homes were not like that. Whether someone lived in a peasant cottage, a town dwelling above a shop, or a chamber inside a manor house, the line between body, fabric, timber, dust, smoke, and animal presence was much thinner than it is for most people today. This does not mean every medieval room was foul or neglected. In fact, many households worked hard to maintain order. Floors were swept, rushes were changed, linens were aired, garments were brushed, and people certainly valued cleanliness. But even a well-kept room could still offer exactly the kind of shelter parasites needed. A flea's success depends on access. Access to warmth, access to hosts, access to cloth, bedding, cracks in wood, straw, fur, and the constant movement of living bodies through shared spaces. Medieval Europe provided all of that in abundance. Houses were full of textiles that were difficult to wash thoroughly and slow to dry. Bedding could be thick, layered, and expensive enough that it was preserved carefully rather than replaced casually. Straw-filled mattresses, coverlets, woolen blankets, fur linings, and padded garments all created environments where insects might linger. Even where people took trouble to air things out, the conditions of daily life worked against complete control. And here the first quiet twist appears. Fleas were not just a problem of poverty. Poverty could certainly make them harder to escape, especially in crowded housing with fewer changes of clothing and less access to private sleeping space. But wealth did not create immunity. The noble household had better fabrics, more servants, and more rooms, yet it also possessed upholstered goods, curtains, furs, travel baggage, hunting dogs, stable connections, and a larger stream of visitors. A grand chamber might be more comfortable than a village hut, but comfort itself could harbor pests. The poor suffered more sharply from exposure and constraint, but the rich were not living in a separate biological universe. Fleas moved across class lines with remarkable ease. To understand what it was like to live with them, we have to slow down and stay close to the body. Imagine waking before sunrise in winter. The room is cold, though the bedding has held some warmth through the night. The blanket is heavy. The shirt worn to sleep may also be the shirt worn through much of the next day. You begin to notice the small stinging irritation at the ankle, then at the waist, then somewhere beneath the layers where a seam rests against the skin. It is not necessarily unbearable. In fact, part of the historical truth is that many people likely experienced this so often that they moved through it with weary familiarity. But that familiarity did not make it pleasant. It simply made it ordinary. Ordinary discomfort changes behavior. It changes how people scratch, how they inspect cloth, how they sit close to the hearth, how they value a fresh shift of linen, how carefully they shake a blanket, how often they worry over children, and how they judge the difference between tolerable nuisance and real infestation. Medieval people did not need modern microbiology to recognize that some living conditions were more troublesome than others. They observed relationships between warmth, animals, old bedding, crowded sleeping arrangements, and biting insects. Their explanations did not always match modern science, but practical knowledge often ran ahead of theory. This is an important distinction because modern people sometimes imagine the medieval world as trapped inside superstition alone. In reality, daily life produced a large body of experience-based habit. A servant airing bedding in the sun, a housewife changing rushes, a traveler examining his cloak, a monk tending the dormitory. These were not random gestures. They were responses to repeated physical problems. Not all measures worked equally well, and many would only reduce rather than eliminate insects, but the effort itself matters. It reminds us that medieval people were not passively resigned to discomfort. They were managing within limits. Those limits were substantial. Water had to be carried. Fuel had to be gathered or purchased. Laundry was labor-intensive. Soap existed, but its availability and use varied. Full washing of heavy items was difficult, especially in cold weather. Drying thick woolens or stuffed bedding could take time and space that many households did not have. Even when garments were cleaned, reinfestation was always possible because no one lived in isolation. Family members shared beds. Servants slept together. Inns turned over travelers continuously. Pilgrims lodged in crowded quarters. Soldiers marched, camped, borrowed cloth, and bedded near animals. Markets brought people and goods together. Fleas did not need permanent victory. They only needed repeated opportunities. Animals were central to this story. Cats and dogs lived in many households, and not merely as sentimental companions. Cats guarded stores against mice. Dogs helped with work, guarding, hunting, and waste. Horses, oxen, sheep, goats, and pigs might be housed near people, especially in rural settings where warmth, security, and practicality pulled human and animal life into close arrangement. Even when animals were not sleeping directly in the living space, their presence nearby mattered. Stables, yards, sheds, carts, wool, hides, and fleas carried in on fur all helped maintain a world in which insects traveled easily between hosts and habitats. And yet, even here, the picture resists simplification. Medieval people did not simply welcome filth. They often found bad smells offensive. They recognized stale air as unpleasant. Urban authorities sometimes issued regulations about waste, butchers' refuse, and street conditions. Monastic rules valued order. Elite households valued presentation and disciplined service. Personal grooming mattered. Combs, linen underlayers, hand-washing, scented herbs, and various household remedies all had their place. The world was more vulnerable to parasites than ours, but it was not indifferent to them. One reason fleas remained so persistent is that they occupied the exact zone where inconvenience, embarrassment, and biology met. They were small enough to evade easy control, common enough to seem almost inevitable, but irritating enough to demand attention. They also disrupted sleep, and that should not be underestimated. Medieval life already involved long labor, uncertain weather, seasonal scarcity, illness, and little privacy. Rest mattered deeply. To lie down after a day of work only to be bitten repeatedly by creatures hidden somewhere in the bedding or clothing would have added a special kind of exhaustion, the sort that frays patience without leaving dramatic records. Children likely experienced this world differently from adults. For a child born into it, fleas may have seemed less shocking than simply normal, another recurring discomfort like smoke in the rafters or cold hands in winter. But children were also physically more vulnerable to scratching, sleeplessness, and the minor skin infections that could follow irritated bites. Parents, especially mothers and caretakers, would have spent time checking garments, tending skin, and trying to keep sleeping places as manageable as possible. Domestic history often survives only in fragments, yet it is there in the logic of the household. Someone noticed, someone cleaned, someone worried, someone endured. Town life created its own variations. In a medieval town, people lived closer together. Workshops, storerooms, kitchens, sleeping chambers, and sometimes animals could occupy adjoining spaces in dense arrangements. Trade brought cloth, hides, sacks, travelers, and second-hand goods from elsewhere. And it might seem, in theory, like a place of comfort for the road-weary, but it was also one of the most efficient exchange points for pests. A traveler could arrive already carrying insects in his clothing or baggage, sleep in a bed used by others, then leave with even more than he brought. In this sense, fleas were companions of mobility. They flourished not only in stagnant poverty, but in the movement of commerce and pilgrimage. This is where the subject becomes historically revealing in a wider sense. Fleas help us see medieval Europe as deeply connected. Not connected in the modern sense of instant communication, but through roads, trade, lodging, transport animals, textiles, and human proximity. The very systems that sustained medieval society also sustained its smaller, less welcome passengers. A merchant's cloak, a servant's blanket, a monastery guest bed, a manor kennel, a ship's sleeping berth, each belonged to a network. Fleas were part of that network too. Medical understanding of the period could describe symptoms more easily than invisible causes. Medieval medicine inherited ideas from classical authorities and combined them with practical treatment, religious belief, local custom, and herbal knowledge. People used various powders, washes, smoke, plants, and cleaning methods to repel pests or soothe bites. Some remedies were sensible, some limited, some symbolic. But here again, the important point is not whether they possessed modern entomology. It is that the problem was real enough to generate remedies at all. A society does not invent household responses to something it barely notices. There was also a moral and emotional dimension. The body in medieval Christian Europe was never just biological. It was disciplined, clothed, judged, humbled, washed, adorned, and interpreted. Persistent pests, therefore, belonged not only to physical life but to the felt experience of inconvenience, irritation, humility, and social embarrassment. To scratch oneself in company, to worry over bedding prepared for a guest, to keep a respectable chamber, to manage servants and linens well, all of this touched reputation as much as comfort. Cleanliness was not merely practical. It could signal order, competence, and status. But the deeper irony is that status only partly helped. Wealth could buy more linen, better storage, more servants, and more privacy. It could not fully solve the structural problem of living in a world made of wool, timber, straw, fur, smoke, and shared warmth. Medieval people could reduce the burden, but rarely abolish it. And because they could not abolish it, they adapted. If you pause there for a moment, the medieval world begins to feel less like a painted pageant and more like a lived environment. Not just kings, bishops, battles, and cathedrals, but itching skin in the dark, the smell of warmed wool, the effort of keeping a bed tolerable, the relief of fresh linen, the annoyance of a bite just as sleep begins to settle in. These details are modest, but they change how history feels. They return scale to the individual life. And in the next part of this story, that ordinary irritation leads us somewhere larger than it first appears, because once we move from the home into the bedchamber, the monastery dormitory, the inn, and the road itself, we begin to see how medieval ideas of cleanliness, health, privacy, and even social order were shaped by the daily struggle to keep the body comfortable in a world that never quite let it rest. And that effort to keep the body comfortable in a world that never quite let it rest becomes even clearer when we move into the places where medieval people were most vulnerable, the places where they undressed, slept, shared warmth, and surrendered, for a few hours at least, the small defenses of movement and daylight. A room could be cleaned, a floor could be swept, a bench could be brushed down, but a bed was something else. A bed held the memory of the body. It collected heat, dust, fibers, crumbs, skin, fur, and whatever else daily life carried into it. In medieval Europe, the bed was one of the most valuable objects in a household, and also one of the most difficult to make fully clean in any modern sense. For poorer families, sleeping arrangements were often compressed by necessity. Several people might share one bed, or sleep close together on pallets, stuffed mattresses, or simple bedding spread on benches or floors. That closeness made sense. Preserved warmth, especially in winter. Saved space. It reflected the fact that privacy, as many modern viewers imagine it, was a luxury rather than a default condition. But closeness also meant that discomfort circulated. If one person brought fleas into the sleeping space, everyone around them could feel the result. The problem was not limited to one body. It became communal, another quiet reminder that medieval domestic life was collective in ways that could be comforting and burdensome at the same time. In more prosperous homes, the bed could be larger, softer, and surrounded by signs of status. There might be hangings, a proper frame, feather bedding, embroidered covers, carved posts, and curtains meant to conserve warmth and display refinement. To later eyes, such a bed looks like an escape from hardship. And in many ways it was. Better bedding, more linen, and better served chambers meant genuine comfort. But that very comfort came with its own difficulty. Curtains trapped warmth, and warmth attracted bodies. Feathers, quilts, furs, and layered textiles created luxurious surfaces. Yet they also created places where tiny pests could survive between bouts of cleaning. The contradiction is worth lingering over. Medieval wealth could soften the body's contact with the world, but it could also create richer material environments for parasites to inhabit. This is one of the reasons household labor mattered so much. Beds were not static objects. They had to be maintained. Sheets and covers were aired. Straw or stuffing could be changed. Curtains were shaken out. Linen was washed when possible. Storage mattered. Sunlight mattered. Smoke may have had some incidental effect in certain spaces, though it was never a reliable solution. Servants in elite households, wives and daughters in middling homes, and laboring women in modest cottages all participated, in different ways, in the endless work of keeping bedding usable. That work could not create sterility, but it could make the difference between ordinary nuisance and something more relentless. Season mattered too. In warmer weather, fleas became more active, and the burden could intensify. Summer was not simply a pleasant season of light and open air. It could also mean more insects, more smells rising from crowded settlements, and more difficulty keeping cloth fresh when life was busy with labor, travel, fairs, and harvest preparations. Winter, by contrast, reduced some forms of insect activity, but it created other problems. People shut doors, drew curtains, slept close together, and held onto thick layers for warmth. Bedding might be aired less often, washing could become harder, and the cold itself limited what was practical. So while the exact experience changed with the seasons, No season fully removed the problem. Medieval life offered fluctuation rather than escape. Monasteries and convents offer another revealing setting. It is easy to imagine these religious spaces as cleaner, more orderly, more controlled than the world outside, and in some respects they were. Monastic life was governed by rule, routine, and supervision. Beds might be simpler. Dormitories could be better regulated than many private homes. Clothing was tied to discipline and identity. Yet monasteries were also communal institutions. People slept in shared environments. They stored garments. They traveled between houses. They received visitors. They cared for the sick. They lived in stone and timber buildings that could be cold, damp, and difficult to maintain perfectly. The religious setting did not suspend material reality. If anything, it sometimes exposed the tension between spiritual ideals and bodily persistence even more clearly. That tension mattered because medieval Christianity placed real emphasis on self-control, humility, and endurance. Bodily irritation could become, at least in some writings and devotional attitudes, part of the larger challenge of living in a fallen world. This did not mean people welcomed fleas as holy companions. Far from it. Irritation remained irritation. But it does help explain why medieval people often inhabited discomfort without turning every such hardship into a crisis of expectation. Their world did not promise bodily ease. Rest was valued, cleanliness was valued, comfort was valued, but none were assumed as permanent rights. The body was fragile, vulnerable, and frequently inconvenient. Fleas fit into that worldview all too naturally. Travel made matters worse. To move through medieval Europe was to pass from one uncertain sleeping place to another. Pilgrims lodged in hospices and inns. Merchants slept in shared rooms or on straw. Students, clerics, messengers, sailors, and soldiers carried their lives on their backs, in saddlebags, on carts, or in chests. They often slept where they could. A good inn might offer relative comfort, food, fire, and a proper bed, but it also represented concentrated turnover. Sheets might be changed inconsistently. Bedding was used by stranger after stranger. Animals waited outside or in adjoining structures. Dust and traffic came in from the road. A traveler lying down in such a place may have felt gratitude for shelter, yet that gratitude did not guarantee a peaceful night. It is not difficult to imagine how this shaped the psychology of travel. Modern tourism often assumes a room belongs briefly to the guest. In the medieval world, lodging was more obviously borrowed, and the bed more obviously shared across time by many unknown bodies. Even an expensive lodging had a history you could feel but not see. The irritation of fleas, then, was not just physical. It reinforced the uncertainty of being away from home. It reminded travelers that comfort was provisional and that the road left traces behind. Military life made the same problem harsher still. Campaigning armies slept in camps, barns, churches, abandoned structures, tents, and seized quarters. Clothing was worn hard, rarely washed thoroughly, and exposed to mud, sweat, rain, and animals. Men slept in groups, often exhausted beyond complaint. Under such conditions, fleas were only one small misery among many, but precisely because they were small, they could become constant. A soldier might accept hunger, fear, and weather as part of war, yet still lose sleep to the crawling irritation in his bedding or the biting at the neck and leg where cloth rubbed against skin. History often records strategy, banners, marches, and casualties. It says less about the cumulative fatigue of living day after day inside one's own unclean layers. And still, what is striking is not only the persistence of the problem, but the persistence of responses. Medieval households and communities used all sorts of methods to deter pests. Some herbs were strewn with the hope of repelling insects. Strong-smelling plants were valued in part because fragrance itself was associated with freshness and correction, a way of imposing order on what was stale or corrupted. Bedding was beaten and shaken. Garments were brushed and aired. Fleas might be picked off by hand. Combs, though more often associated with hair and lice, were part of a wider culture of close bodily inspection. There were also recipes and remedies in household and medical traditions that attempted to soothe bites or drive insects away. Not every remedy had real power. Some were probably ineffective. But even ineffective remedies tell us something important. They tell us the problem was common enough to produce a repertoire. This repertoire varied by region and class, but the logic behind it was often practical. Light, air, dryness, fresh linen, and distance from animal bedding all helped, even when medieval people described their reasoning in terms different from ours. They may not have understood the insect life cycle in modern scientific language, but repeated observation taught them what made things worse. Dampness, crowding, old stuffing, stale cloth, and poorly managed sleeping spaces often invited trouble. That kind of knowledge did not belong only to physicians. It belonged to ordinary people, especially those responsible for maintaining households. Here, another important reversal appears. When people imagine medieval hygiene, they often think first about bathing, as if washing the entire body were the sole or primary measure of cleanliness. But daily cleanliness was broader than bathing alone. Changing linen, washing hands and face, brushing clothing, cleaning floors, managing waste, tending bedding, and airing fabrics all mattered. In fact, undergarments of linen were especially significant because they sat between the body and outer garments, absorbing sweat and oils and making it easier to keep at least part of one's clothing system fresh. A wealthy person with many changes of linen had a real advantage. A poorer person with fewer garments faced a much harder struggle. Yet neither existed in a world free of infestation. The difference was one of degree and manageability rather than total safety. That distinction also shaped social perceptions. A person who seemed visibly neglected, excessively scratched, foul-smelling, or unable to care for bedding might be judged as disorderly or degraded. At the same time, everyone knew that insects could trouble almost any household. So there was a quiet social line between ordinary nuisance and shameful neglect. Crossing that line mattered. It could affect servants' reputations, innkeepers' standing, and the perceived competence of a household mistress. A noble guest might forgive some discomfort as part of travel, but a notoriously verminous chamber could insult status itself. Urban records and moral literature sometimes reveal this concern indirectly. Complaints about filth, overcrowding, unwholesome air, and poor management were not merely abstract civic worries. They touched daily bodily experience. Fleas belonged to a wider ecology of discomfort that included lice, bedbugs, smoke, refuse, damp walls, and foul drains. One problem often accompanied another. This is why fleas cannot be understood in isolation. They were part of an entire material environment in which the body was constantly negotiating with its surroundings. The body, in turn, responded in ways both immediate and long-term. Flea bites could be itchy, distracting, and maddeningly persistent. Scratching could open the skin, especially in children or in adults already worn down by labor and poor nutrition. Minor irritations might become more troublesome when cleanliness was hard to maintain. Sleep could be interrupted night after night, producing a dull exhaustion that rarely enters formal chronicles but must have been widespread. When we talk about medieval resilience, this is part of what we mean. And yet resilience should not be romanticized. There is a temptation, in history, to admire endurance so much that discomfort becomes picturesque. It was not picturesque to wake scratching in a cold room. It was not picturesque to prepare a guest bed and worry it might embarrass you. It was not picturesque to travel for days and find that the inn offered shelter but not rest. What makes the history meaningful is not that people heroically accepted flea bites with stoic grace. It is that they lived full moral, social, and emotional lives while carrying burdens that modern viewers would find wearing and intimate. Even literature and art sometimes preserve traces of this intimacy. Medieval and early post-medieval texts could treat fleas with humor, irritation, flirtation, or disgust. Small pests drifted into poems, moral observations, and everyday sayings because they were familiar enough to function as shared reference points. That familiarity is revealing. People do not joke, complain, or moralize about things entirely outside their experience. Fleas were culturally legible because they were part of common life. There is also a more serious historical shadow hanging behind the subject, one that later centuries would make impossible to ignore. For now, in the period we are dwelling in, most people experienced fleas chiefly as a persistent nuisance woven into domestic existence. But over time, and especially in the context of epidemic disease, these tiny creatures would acquire a darker significance in modern historical memory. The medieval person scratching at a bite in an ordinary bedchamber did not necessarily interpret it that way. For them, the immediate reality was simpler and more exhausting. The bite, the itch, the search through cloth, the shaking of blankets, the effort to reclaim a little peace. And once we understand that ordinary reality, the next question becomes harder and more interesting. If fleas were so common, how did people explain them within the larger medieval understanding of health, illness, air, environment, and divine order? What did physicians, household guides, and practical caretakers think they were really managing when they tried to keep rooms, garments, and bodies in better condition? Because the answer draws us deeper into the medieval theory of the body itself, and into a world where a bite on the skin could connect, however faintly, to ideas about imbalance, corruption, and the fragile boundary between a habitable home and an unhealthy one. Because the answer draws us deeper into the medieval theory of the body itself, and into a world where a bite on the skin could connect, however faintly, to ideas about imbalance, corruption, and the fragile boundary between a habitable home and an unhealthy one. Medieval medicine did not begin from the modern notion of germs moving invisibly from host to host. Instead, it tended to understand health through a broader and more atmospheric framework, one shaped by inherited classical learning, practical observation, and Christian moral culture. Bodies were thought to exist in relation to diet, sleep, labor, age, weather, emotion, season, and surrounding air. Good health meant balance. Illness often suggested disturbance. And so the management of fleas belonged, in part, to the management of environment itself. This helps explain why so much medieval advice, whether written in learned texts or expressed through ordinary household custom, focused on conditions rather than single causes. A room that was damp, stale, crowded, badly aired, or full of decaying material could be understood as unhealthy not because someone had isolated a specific microbe, but because the environment itself seemed corrupted. Air mattered immensely. Smell mattered. Rot mattered. The visible and the invisible were not sharply separated in the way modern science would later separate them. If something smelled foul, if bedding seemed old and close, if the chamber felt heavy and stagnant, that was already evidence enough that the space needed correction. And here there is another subtle twist in the story. Medieval people were not wrong to connect discomfort with surroundings. Their theories differed from ours, but many of their responses still had practical value. Opening a room, airing cloth, drying bedding, replacing old stuffing, washing linen, clearing refuse, separating animals from sleeping spaces when possible, all of these could reduce the burden of pests even if the reasoning behind them was framed through humors, miasmas, or the general quality of the air. This is one of the most important things to understand if we want to avoid the easy mistake of condescension. Historical actors do not need modern terminology in order to notice patterns in the world around them. Medical writers of the medieval and late medieval periods inherited from antiquity a concern with regimen, what one ate, how much one slept, when one exercised, what kind of air one breathed, and how one adjusted habits according to the seasons. Fleas fit awkwardly but naturally into that universe. They were not usually treated as the grand center of medical theory, yet they appeared within discussions of household management, skin irritation, and the maintenance of tolerable living conditions. Remedies often blended direct action with environmental adjustment. Herbs might be recommended not only because they were thought to repel pests, but because their scent, dryness, or purifying qualities seemed corrective in a wider sense. Smoke or fumigation might be used because smoke was seen as altering the quality of a space, driving out what did not belong there. Even sweeping and changing rushes could be part of restoring proper order. The flooring of a room deserves a moment of attention here, because it tells us much about what it was like to inhabit these interiors day after day. In many homes, especially outside the wealthiest circles, floors were not smooth modern surfaces that could be vacuumed and sealed. They might be packed earth, boards, or stone, often covered with rushes or strewn materials that softened the space, absorbed spills, and helped with warmth. Fresh rushes could make a room feel cleaner and more pleasant. Old rushes, left too long, could gather dirt, scraps, moisture, and all sorts of living things. This is one reason the household itself was such an important unit of health. Not the isolated individual, but the managed space. A competent household was one that could maintain a degree of order over food, storage, bedding, waste, fire, water, and bodies. In theory, this gave the mistress of a house, or in larger settings the stewards and servants who answered to her or to the head of the household, a role that was quietly medical as well as domestic. To prepare a clean bed, to keep linen in decent condition, to prevent stale accumulation in a sleeping chamber, these were not trivial matters. They stood somewhere between comfort, morality, and health. Class differences shaped these possibilities sharply. An aristocratic household might have chests for storage, extra linens, separate chambers, servants to air bedding, and access to imported goods or rare herbs. A middling urban family might manage a respectable and orderly home but have fewer reserves and less space. A poor rural family might know perfectly well what ought to be done and still lack the time, fuel, cloth, privacy, or labor needed to do it thoroughly. That is an important distinction. Medieval discomfort often grew not from ignorance but from constraint. People were forced into compromises. A blanket that should have been aired remained in use because the weather had turned. Straw that ought to have been replaced lasted longer because harvest labor was urgent. A dog that ideally slept apart was allowed close because the night was bitter and the need for warmth, security, or convenience outweighed the risk of pests. That kind of compromise was everywhere. It is easy, looking backward, to imagine that people made clean divisions between healthy practice and unhealthy practice. But real life rarely works that way. A medieval family might know that old bedding could become troublesome and still keep using it because replacement was expensive. They might value fresh linen and still wear garments longer than ideal because washing and drying took labor and weather. They might understand the advantage of cleaner sleeping space and still crowd together because warmth was life. Fleas flourished in that zone between knowledge and necessity. The same tension shaped attitudes toward bathing. Modern discussions of medieval cleanliness often become distorted because they ask the wrong question. Did medieval people bathe as frequently as modern urban populations with indoor plumbing? Of course not. But that comparison can conceal more than it reveals. Bathing practices varied enormously by region, period, class, and circumstance. Public bathhouses existed in many towns at different times. Private washing, at least of the face, hands, and certain parts of the body, was common. Linen shifts and undergarments absorbed sweat and could be changed more often than outer clothing. People did not live without any concept of bodily freshness. The problem was that full bodily washing, however desirable, could not by itself solve the environmental persistence of fleas. One might wash and still return to the same bed, the same blanket, the same room, the same animal proximity, the same clothing seems where pests could hide. That is another reason fleas were such a particular kind of frustration. They blurred the line between personal care and environmental defeat. A person could feel that they had done what was proper, washed, changed linen, brushed garments, prepared bedding, and still find the nuisance returning. For historians, that is revealing, because it reminds us that medieval people experienced bodily care not as a clean victory over nature, but as continual negotiation. Health was maintained, not secured. Cleanliness was pursued, not perfected. Urban life added further complications through density and trade. Cloth markets, second-hand goods, hostels, workshops, and crowded alleys all helped connect one household's problem to another's. A bundle of garments bought used, a wool blanket transported from elsewhere, a servant coming from another household, a traveler sleeping one night and moving on the next, all could move insects across the social landscape. In that sense, fleas belonged to commerce. Not in the dramatic way spices or silver did, but in the quieter way that everyday circulation carries both wealth and inconvenience. Medieval Europe was full of movement. Fleas moved with it. Ports made this especially true. Along the coasts and navigable rivers of Europe, ships brought people, cargo, animals, cloth, hides, grain, and vermin into constant contact. A shipboard sleeping space was cramped, humid, and difficult to cleanse thoroughly. Sailors and passengers shared close quarters. Cargo created shelter for pests. Bedding was limited, often reused, and not easily laundered at sea. When ships came into harbor, they connected maritime discomfort to urban domestic life. The sailor returning to land, the merchant renting a room, the porter carrying bales, the inn receiving new guests, all formed part of a chain through which tiny creatures could travel unnoticed. Yet the emotional tone of living with fleas was not always identical. Sometimes it would have been simple irritation, sometimes embarrassment, sometimes fatigue, sometimes resignation, sometimes household annoyance directed at servants, children, or animals. Sometimes the problem might even enter the register of humor, because people often joke about the things they cannot completely avoid. There is a very human pattern there. Repeated nuisance can become part of the language of ordinary complaint. Not every bite signaled disaster. Not every sleepless night turned philosophical. Many such moments were probably met with a grim practicality. Shake the blanket, warm the bed, check the seams, carry on. For women, especially those responsible for children, bedding, and daily domestic order, the burden may have been especially layered. Caring for a household meant caring not only for food and fire but for skins, cloth, and sleeping arrangements. An infant's irritation, a child's scratching, a husband's complaint, a guest's impression, all could fall back into the field of household responsibility. That does not mean women alone bore the problem, but in much of medieval Europe they were central to managing its consequences inside the home. In elite households, female servants and laundresses labored through the endless cycle of linen and bedding. In humble homes, the same work was often done with fewer resources and less relief. The social history of fleas is therefore also a history of hidden labor. That labor mattered because a respectable household was judged partly by what visitors experienced. Medieval hospitality was morally and socially important. To receive a guest well was not a small thing. Food, warmth, and a bed were signs of status, obligation, and honor. A troubled sleeping place could undercut all of that. So even though everyone knew discomfort was common, householders still cared very much about how tolerable their space seemed to others. The better the house, the stronger the expectation. A lord's chamber, a merchant's guest room, a monastic hostelry, all were supposed to express order. Fleas made that expression precarious. The irony, again, is that the most richly appointed interiors could be among the most materially complex. Tapestries, cushions, padded seats, curtained beds, furs, and layered textiles made spaces beautiful, warm, and prestigious. They also created softness, folds, and hidden spaces in which parasites might persist. Stone castles, too, often imagined as cold fortresses of perfect control, were full of drafts, servants' traffic, dogs, stored goods, rushes, and fabrics that had to be constantly managed. Nobility did not float above biology. It lived inside costly attempts to domesticate it. There is also the matter of smell, which medieval people noticed more acutely as a moral and environmental sign than we sometimes remember. Pleasant scents were valued not only because they gave delight, but because they seemed to correct the atmosphere of a space. Herbs strewn on floors, fragrant woods, incense, washed linen, even the general smell of fresh air entering a room. These all signaled that a chamber was being governed properly. A foul-smelling or stale room suggested the opposite. Fleas were not always directly identified through smell, of course, but the management of smell and the management of pests were often part of the same larger effort to keep a room from slipping into unhealthy disorder. This matters because medieval environmental thinking was, in its own way, highly relational. A body slept in a bed, inside a room, inside a house, within a season, within a social rank, within a moral world. None of these layers were neatly separated. A bad harvest might reduce the household's ability to replace bedding. A hard winter might force closer sleeping arrangements. Poverty might lead to more second-hand cloth. A growing town might mean denser housing and less open space. The flea, small as it was, sat inside all of these larger pressures. It is one of those details that becomes more revealing the longer we keep our attention on it. And then, beyond nuisance, there was fear. Not constant terror, not every day, but periodic fear when bites, fever, and rumor seemed to align. For much of daily life, fleas were simply part of the ordinary burden of existence. But ordinary burdens can take on darker meanings when disease begins to circulate. A household that tolerated nightly irritation under normal conditions might look at the same signs differently in times of sickness. The line between nuisance and omen could narrow quickly. A community already accustomed to living with pests might suddenly become more attentive to what they signified when illness moved from house to house. That darker shadow will matter more as the centuries move forward, and especially when we enter the world shaped by recurrent plague. But before we arrive there, it is worth lingering a little longer in the domestic and social space where fleas were still, for most people, one irritation among many. Because only by understanding that ordinary familiarity can we understand how extraordinary later fear must have felt. The same insect that had once been part of the background texture because once plague enters the picture, the quiet domestic history of sleepless nights and itchy bedding begins to intersect with something much larger, and the medieval bedchamber no longer feels like quite the same place at all. Up to that point, for many households, fleas had belonged to the category of ordinary hardship, unwelcome but familiar, irritating but rarely worthy of formal record unless they appeared in remedies, satire, complaint, or scattered references to household conditions. But epidemic disease changes the scale of attention. It alters what people notice, what they fear, and what they begin to connect in retrospect, even if they do not yet understand the true mechanism linking one thing to another. Off bedding and clothing could, under altered historical conditions, appear in a far more troubling light. So the next step in this story is not merely biological. It is psychological and social. What happened to the meaning of fleas when medieval Europe encountered epidemic mortality on a scale that reshaped memory itself? How did an everyday nuisance become entangled, however imperfectly and unevenly, with one of the great historical crises of the age? Because once plague enters the picture, the quiet domestic history of sleepless nights and itchy bedding begins to intersect with something much larger, and the medieval bedchamber no longer feels like quite the same place at all. It is important here to move carefully and not allow later knowledge to flatten medieval experience. Modern viewers, familiar with the association between fleas and plague, can be tempted to imagine that people in the 14th century looked at every bite with immediate dread, as though the relationship were obvious in their own time. It was not. Medieval people did not possess bacteriology. They did not understand plague in the terms a modern epidemiologist would use, and they did not live inside a single, unified explanation of contagion. They interpreted disease through overlapping languages of divine judgment: corrupted air, imbalance, environmental disturbance, human vulnerability, and practical observation. That means the presence of fleas was troubling in one register, but not always in the exact way that hindsight encourages us to imagine. Still, hindsight should not blind us to the scale of transformation that epidemic plague introduced. When the Black Death spread across Europe in the mid-14th century, it did not merely kill in extraordinary numbers. It changed the emotional climate of ordinary life. Spaces once associated mainly with rest, domestic routine, and familiar discomfort could become charged with dread. A bed was no longer only a place of warmth and nightly irritation. It might become the place where fever began, where weakness deepened, where someone lay apart from others if separation was possible, or where a household realized that ordinary suffering had given way to something far more severe. In that altered atmosphere, small creatures and domestic nuisances could be reinterpreted, even if imperfectly. The medieval mind did not need to identify the exact biological chain in order to sense that disease moved through environments, households, roads, ports, markets, and bodies. People observed patterns. They saw that some houses suffered and others, for a time, did not. They saw that crowded towns were dangerous, that foul places seemed suspect, that certain seasons brought fear, that movement carried risk, and that one sick body often seemed to foreshadow another. Fleas remained part of the household world in which all of this took place. Even when they were not singled out as the principal cause, they belonged to the texture of places people were now examining with fresh anxiety. The deeper twist is that plague did not make the ordinary history of fleas less important. It made it more important. The very reason fleas could matter in epidemic conditions was that they were already woven into the routines of human life. They were already in bedding, clothing, animal spaces, inns, ships, and crowded domestic interiors. They did not arrive as strangers at the moment of crisis. They were familiar presences living inside familiar structures. That is what makes the subject quietly unsettling. The things people had spent generations tolerating as part of daily life could, under certain conditions, become entangled with catastrophe. Ports and trade routes matter enormously here. The plague did not move through a static Europe. It moved through a continent increasingly connected by maritime commerce, overland trade, military movement, pilgrimage, and urban exchange. Ships brought grain, cloth, furs, spices, metals, letters, passengers, and animals. They also brought the hidden ecological companions of trade. Cargo did not travel alone. Rats, fleas, dirt, textiles, food stores, and bedding all formed part of an environment in motion. A ship entering port was a floating fragment of another world, and whatever lived within its holds, cabins, sacks, and wooden joints could pass into warehouses, taverns, inns, streets, and homes. From there, the ordinary forms of medieval domestic life did the rest. Crowded housing, close sleeping arrangements, second-hand goods, the exchange of garments, the presence of animals, and the difficulty of maintaining perfectly clean interiors all helped transform local outbreaks into communal crises. Again, medieval observers did not map this process in modern terms. But they were not blind to connection. They knew that disease spread through networks of contact and environment, even if their explanations remained broader and more atmospheric than ours. It is telling that so many responses to plague involved not just prayer and penitence, but also efforts to regulate movement, quarantine ships, clean spaces, manage waste, control gatherings, and flee certain environments. These actions emerged from observation as much as theory. And if we stay with the bedchamber for a moment, we can see how plague intensified the emotional meaning of domestic objects. Bedding, once merely troublesome, could begin to feel suspect. Garments worn by the sick could seem dangerous. Chests, blankets, and linens might carry not just odor and infestation, but memory. The material world became morally and physically heavy. A house after illness was not simply a house. It was a place marked by absence, fear, and the possibility of lingering corruption. Whether that corruption was understood as poisoned air, divine warning, or some residue of sickness, the effect on daily feeling was real. This does not mean that everyone suddenly embarked on rational disinfection campaigns as we would define them. Responses varied widely, and resources were uneven. Some households fled if they could. Others remained because they had no choice. Some burned or abandoned goods. Some aired them. Some prayed over them. Some sought medical advice. Many simply endured uncertainty. For poorer people especially, there was often no practical way to separate a clean from an unclean environment in any lasting sense. They lived where they lived, slept where they could, wore what they owned, and faced disease within conditions they could not meaningfully redesign. That sense of constraint is essential if we want to avoid telling the story as though plague introduced perfect awareness alongside perfect helplessness. In reality, medieval people were neither fully informed nor entirely powerless. They improvised. Cities and towns sometimes adopted public measures. Authorities tried to supervise burials, movement, trade, and cleanliness. Households modified routines when possible. Medical practitioners recommended dietary changes, purgings, bloodletting, aromatic substances, controlled environments, or avoidance of corrupted air. Some advice had little effect. Some may have helped indirectly by reducing exposure to crowded or unhealthy conditions. But always, beneath the theories, the problem remained the same. People were trying to preserve life in a world where the causes of death could not be seen clearly. Fleas occupy a strange position in this landscape because they were both visible and invisible in historical meaning. Visible as nuisances, certainly. Visible as biting creatures found on bodies, animals, and bedding. But invisible in the modern explanatory sense, because their full epidemiological role was not yet known. Medieval people could pick a flea from cloth and know it was undesirable. What they could not do was place it neatly inside a laboratory chain of transmission. That gap between immediate bodily experience and unseen causal power is one of the most haunting aspects of the period. The ordinary annoyance at the skin and the extraordinary terror of plague could coexist without being fully joined in understanding. Over time, repeated outbreaks deepened Europe's experience of living with this uncertainty. The Black Death was not a single event vanishing into the past. It was followed by recurrent visitations, local epidemics, fresh fears, and an enduring awareness that sickness could return. That meant domestic life had to continue under a long shadow. People still married, traded, prayed, cooked, worked, bore children, traveled, entertained guests, and slept in the same kinds of spaces as before. Fleas did not disappear after plague. Beds did not become hygienic islands. The old material conditions continued, but now in a world where mass mortality had exposed just how fragile ordinary routines could be. And this, in a way, brings the story back to the theme that has been quietly guiding it from the beginning. Fleas are not interesting only because they bite. They are interesting because they reveal how medieval people lived within conditions that were normal to them and astonishing to us. Their houses were both homes and biological environments. Their beds were both symbols of comfort and reservoirs of uncertainty. Their clothing offered warmth, dignity, and identity, while also trapping the traces of labor, travel, sweat, and insect life. The flea sits at the edge of all these meanings, small enough to be overlooked, persistent enough to expose the whole system. Class continued to shape the plague experience, though not in a simple way. Wealthier people could sometimes flee cities, withdraw to country estates, purchase cleaner goods, or create more separation within a household. They had more linen, more servants, and greater control over space. Yet wealth did not abolish vulnerability. Country estates had animals, stores, bedding, and human traffic of their own. Servants moved between rooms. Goods arrived from outside. Elite families were linked by travel and politics. A rich chamber could still become a sick chamber. Meanwhile, the poor were often trapped inside density, labor obligations, and scarcity, making both fleas and plague harder to avoid. But the line between privilege and danger remained thinner than comfort alone might suggest. We can see this tension in the cultural atmosphere of the later Middle Ages, where concern with death, bodily decay, and the instability of earthly life becomes more visible in art, preaching, and memory. This was not caused by fleas, of course, but the daily fact of living in bodies subject to irritation, exhaustion, and sickness helped reinforce a worldview in which physical vulnerability was impossible to deny. Medieval spirituality had always recognized human frailty. Recurrent epidemics made that recognition harder, sharper, and more immediate. The body that scratched in ordinary annoyance was also the body that could sicken suddenly. The bed that held a sleeping child or a tired servant was also the bed where fever might keep someone still. And yet life went on in ways that can seem almost startling from a modern distance. Markets reopened. Inns filled again. Churches resumed their routines. Cloth was bought and sold. Travelers kept moving. People reoccupied houses that had seen sickness. Children were born into rooms where older generations had suffered. Bedding was repaired, reused, inherited, and handled once more. This return to ordinary life matters because it reminds us that humans adapt even to conditions marked by fear. Fleas continued to bite not because people were indifferent, but because life required continuity. One cannot suspend domestic existence forever. That continuity produced changes in behavior, though often gradual rather than dramatic. Some places became more attentive to urban sanitation. Certain institutions strengthened rules around quarantine. Medical and household advice continued to circulate and develop. The practical value of fresh air, cleaner surroundings, and more disciplined management of household goods remained strong, even if the underlying theories varied. What changed most may have been not the existence of fleas, but the symbolic weight they carried within a world newly sensitized to hidden danger. The inn is perhaps the clearest image of this changing atmosphere. Before plague, an inn represented the ordinary risk of travel, mixed company, uncertain quality, and the almost expected possibility of pests. After plague, it still represented all of that, but now with an added layer of unease. Who had slept here before? From what town had they come? Was the bedding merely uncomfortable or suspect? Had illness passed through these walls? The traveler entering such a space could not know. That uncertainty did not always stop people from staying, but it changed the mental texture of the stay. The same would have been true of used clothing and household goods. Medieval Europe relied heavily on repair, reuse, and inheritance. Garments were patched, remade, handed down, sold secondhand, or donated. Bedding too could be reused, altered, or redistributed. This thrift was rational and necessary in a world where textiles represented considerable value. But once plague had taught people to think harder about the recent history of objects, the very circulation that made medieval material life economical could also make it troubling. An object was never just an object. It had passed through bodies, rooms, and households, leaving traces no one could fully read. Still, the medieval world did not collapse into total paranoia. People could not afford that practically or psychologically. They developed habits of caution, theories of environment, rituals of purification, and customs of household order that allowed them to continue living inside uncertainty. Fleas remained part of that uncertainty, but not the whole of it. They were one among many reminders that domestic life could never be fully sealed against disorder. The best a household could usually hope for was relative control, a bed tolerable enough to sleep in, clothing decent enough to wear, air fresh enough to trust, and the fragile confidence that tomorrow might resemble today rather than some fresh descent into sickness. That fragile confidence shaped the rhythms of later medieval and early modern life more than we often notice. It shaped how households were arranged, how visitors were received, how servants were supervised, how goods were stored, how sick rooms were feared, and how cleanliness itself was imagined. Cleanliness was not perfection. It was governance. It meant holding the line, as best one could, against the constant return of discomfort, decay, and intrusion. And by holding that line, households revealed a final, revealing paradox. The more medieval people tried to master their interiors, the more clearly they discovered that interiors were never entirely private or self-contained. Roads entered by way of travelers. Markets entered by way of cloth and grain. Animals entered by way of labor and necessity. Weather entered through roof and wall. Disease entered through unknown channels. Fleas entered through all of it. The home, which we often imagine as the opposite of the wider world, was in medieval Europe one of the places where the wider world became intimate. That is what makes the next stage of the story so rich, because once we begin to look beyond plague itself and into the changing domestic culture of the later Middle Ages and early modern centuries, we start to see how people refined the arts of laundering, furnishing, airing, storing, and policing the household in ways that did not eliminate fleas, but did slowly reshape what it meant to live with them. And did slowly reshape what it meant to live with them. By the later Middle Ages, and then more clearly as Europe moved toward the early modern world, household management became more elaborate in some places, more self-conscious, and in certain social circles more intensely tied to ideas of order, refinement, and control. This did not produce a sudden hygienic revolution. Fleas did not politely withdraw because people developed better furniture or more linen. But the meaning of domestic space was changing. Rooms were being thought about differently. Beds were being framed differently. Storage, laundering, and the separation of bodies from one another, however incomplete, became part of a broader reorganization of private life. One of the first things to notice is that medieval and early modern Europe did not move at a single pace. A wealthy household in a major city could change its habits and furnishings more quickly than a poor rural family living with inherited customs and few spare resources. A monastery might preserve one set of routines while an urban merchant family adopted another. Climate mattered. Region mattered. Trade mattered. Even so, over time there was a discernible movement toward greater attention to domestic interiors as managed environments. More chests, more hangings, more specialized rooms, more concern with orderly presentation, more textile care, and more distinction between formal and informal spaces all contributed to a quieter but significant shift. The household was still porous, but in some places it was becoming more carefully curated. that curation is important because fleas thrive where materials accumulate without disciplined handling. The more value people placed on aired linen, separated garments, cleaner bedding, and the selective use of household space, the more they were, whether consciously or not, making life somewhat harder for persistent infestations. Not impossible, but harder. This is where the story resists easy dramatization. There is no single moment when Europe defeated fleas. Instead, there is a long history of partial improvement, unevenly distributed, constantly interrupted by poverty, travel, war, crowding, and the stubborn realities of animal life. But partial improvement matters. It changes what counts as normal. It changes what people complain about, what they tolerate, and what they come to find shameful. Take the bed again, because the bed remains the heart of this whole subject. In a poorer medieval dwelling, the bed might still be a shared arrangement of straw, cloth, wool, and whatever padding could be afforded or assembled. In a grander household, however, the bed increasingly became an object of display as well as comfort. Fine linens, mattresses of better quality, curtains, bolsters, and carefully managed bedchambers all signaled social standing. Yet status was never purely decorative. It had material consequences. More linen meant more chances to change and wash. More servants meant more labor available for airing, brushing, beating, and maintaining. More rooms meant more separation between people, fewer bodies per sleeping space, and better opportunities to isolate troublesome bedding. These were real advantages, though never absolute ones. That shift in expectation is historically important. People do not merely react to discomfort. They react to discomfort against a standard of what they think life ought to feel like. When a nuisance is universal, it is often born with grim familiarity. When improvement becomes imaginable, the same nuisance becomes more offensive. In that sense, the social history of fleas is also a history of rising domestic ambition. As some households grew better furnished, better supplied with linen, better connected to markets, and more invested in notions of decency and order, they became less willing to accept certain discomforts as inevitable. Fleas, once woven into normality, could begin to seem like evidence of failure. Urban growth intensified this tension. Towns and cities offered access to goods, laundresses, bathhouses in certain periods, apothecaries, second-hand markets, and a denser exchange of knowledge about household practice. They also offered crowding, shared walls, rented rooms, transient populations, and faster circulation of both textiles and pests. City life sharpened contrasts. A prosperous merchant might sleep behind carved panels and carefully tended curtains while, only streets away, laborers crowded into rooms where bedding was reused without much respite. Servants crossed between worlds. Goods crossed between worlds. So did insects. Urban refinement did not erase the older ecology of infestation. It coexisted with it, often uncomfortably. It is in this urban setting that household manuals, advice literature, and practical knowledge become especially revealing. People wanted to know how to keep a house well. They wanted guidance about food storage, linens, servants, child rearing, hospitality, health, and repairs. Fleas appear in this larger field not because they were the central obsession of domestic thought, but because they were among the recurring irritations any competent householder had to take seriously. Suggestions might include airing bedding, using certain herbs, changing floor coverings, beating textiles, and keeping animals from sleeping too close to human sleeping areas. Again, the value of such advice lies not only in whether each remedy worked perfectly. It lies in the fact that the household was being conceptualized as something actively managed, something whose condition reflected judgment, discipline, and social worth. Women remained central to this process. In aristocratic houses, the actual labor might be distributed among servants, laundresses, chamber staff, and others, but oversight of domestic order still carried gendered expectations. In middling and poorer homes, much of that labor fell directly on wives, daughters, and female kin. They washed, mended, sorted, aired, inspected, and coped. They were often the first to feel the difference between a freshly prepared bed and a neglected one, the first to hear children complaining of bites, the first to worry about guest impressions, and the first to balance ideals against practical limits. This is one reason the history of fleas belongs not only to medical or environmental history, but to the history of gendered labor and invisible expertise. Male authority, where it entered, often did so indirectly through money, architecture, legal regulation, or complaint. A husband might fund better bedding, build a larger house, insist on standards, or criticize household conditions. But the daily negotiation with cloth, rooms, and bodily comfort was usually closer to the hands of those doing domestic work. That pattern matters because it reminds us that much of history is shaped not by those who issue formal commands, but by those who carry out continual acts of maintenance beneath the threshold of record. Travel, however, remained the great disruptor. However carefully one managed one's own household, the wider world could undo that order quickly. A visit to an inn, a stay with relatives, military service, pilgrimage, student life, apprenticeship, shipping, seasonal labor, or service in another household could expose a person to entirely different conditions. They might return carrying pests in garments or baggage without knowing it. In this sense, improvement at home always existed under pressure from movement beyond the home. The cleaner domestic ideal depended on a stable boundary, and medieval or early modern life rarely offered one for long. We can imagine, then, a merchant in a growing town who has invested in good linen and respectable furnishings. His wife manages the household carefully. Bedding is aired. Garments are stored. Guests are received with proper attention. Then a relative arrives from the road, or a servant returns from market lodgings, or a second-hand chest of textiles enters the house. Within days or weeks, the old irritation begins again. This cycle would have been familiar in countless forms. It is one reason complete household mastery remained elusive. Domestic order could be cultivated, but it could also be interrupted by the very social and economic connections that made prosperity possible. And prosperity itself had a double edge. More goods meant more textiles to care for. More travel meant more exposure. More servants meant more bodies sharing internal spaces. Larger households had more opportunities for pests to circulate from room to room. So while richer households gained tools of control, they also increased the complexity of what needed controlling. There is something almost modern in that contradiction. Greater comfort does not abolish vulnerability. It rearranges it. The emotional consequences of this are worth noticing. In a world where household order was both morally valued and materially fragile, small pests could provoke reactions out of proportion to their size. Annoyance, certainly, but also anxiety, embarrassment, anger at servants, frustration with children, suspicion of guests, and quiet self-reproach. The flea was not just a bite. It was a sign that the line between order and disorder had been crossed somewhere, even if only temporarily. For households that prided themselves on dignity, that sign could sting almost as much as the insect itself. Yet most people, even in better circumstances, still lived with compromise. Animals remained essential. Floors still gathered dust. Bedding was expensive. Laundry remained laborious. Weather still interfered. Smoke still blackened interiors. Shared sleeping remained common across much of society. And so the older medieval experience of adaptation never fully vanished. Even as expectations changed, endurance remained part of domestic character. One shook out the blanket, changed what linen one could, set herbs where custom advised, scolded the dog away from the bed, and tried again. In more rural settings, change often came more slowly. Cottages and farmhouses remained deeply entangled with labor, weather, and animals. The need for warmth, especially in northern climates, made complete separation from livestock or work materials impractical in many circumstances. A family might understand very well that cleaner, more isolated sleeping arrangements were preferable and still be unable to create them. Here again, history is not a tale of backwardness but of limited options. A cold child, a lambing season, a storm, a poor harvest, a damaged roof. All of these mattered more immediately than the abstract ideal of a pest-free chamber. So when we ask what it was like to live with fleas in medieval Europe, and as that medieval world slowly shades into something later, the answer becomes more layered rather than less. It meant physical irritation, certainly. It meant interrupted sleep, scratching, inspection, and the endless household work of reduction rather than elimination. But it also meant living inside a civilization learning, very gradually, to imagine domestic comfort more ambitiously. The flea became a tiny but persistent adversary of that ambition, a reminder that order was labor-intensive and never complete. And perhaps the most revealing point of all is that people's responses to fleas tell us how seriously they took ordinary life. They cared about beds. They cared about air. They cared about what touched the skin, what guests noticed, what children suffered, what servants neglected, what rooms smelled like, what a decent household ought to feel like after nightfall. These concerns were not trivial. They were the substance of civilization at its most intimate level, which is why the next part of the story leads naturally toward the objects and routines themselves, toward the combs, chests, bed curtains, laundries, rushes, herbs, chamber pots, warming pans, animal skins, and linen shifts through which medieval and early modern people tried, night after night, to hold their sleeping world together against creatures small enough to hide almost anywhere. Medieval and early modern people developed a whole, quiet technology of defense, not modern in the industrial sense, but practical, repetitive, and deeply woven into the rhythm of domestic life. If we want to understand what it truly felt like to live with fleas, we have to look not only at the insects themselves, but at the objects people handled every morning and every evening in the attempt to keep sleeping space tolerable. These objects are easy to overlook in grander history. Yet once we place them back into view, the bedchamber becomes almost a workshop of constant management. Consider first the linen shift, the simple underlayer that sat closest to the skin. It did not attract admiration in the way a velvet gown or a fur-lined mantle might. It was rarely the garment that announced rank to the outside world. But in terms of bodily comfort, it mattered immensely. It took the friction of the body, absorbed sweat, and formed a replaceable layer between skin and heavier clothing. For those who could afford more than one or two, the ability to change linen offered one of the clearest sensations of refreshment available in an age without modern plumbing. A fresh shift could not promise freedom from fleas, but it could reduce the sense of stale accumulation, and in a world where discomfort often came in layers, removing even one layer mattered. The same is true of bedding itself. Medieval beds were not uniform things. A laborer's pallet, a rope-strung frame in a modest urban house, a box bed in some northern regions, and a high-status curtain bed in a wealthy chamber all belonged to the same broad category while offering very different experiences. What they shared was their dependence on materials that held traces of use. Straw mattresses compressed, shifted, and gathered debris. Feather beds offered softness but also demanded care. Blankets and coverlets collected dust, fur, and bodily residue over time. Bolsters and pillows had seams and stuffing. Every one of these items needed attention if the bed was to remain even moderately comfortable. That attention could be surprisingly physical. Bedding was not merely folded neatly. It was shaken, beaten, lifted, aired, and in some cases taken outside when weather allowed. Sunlight mattered not because medieval households possessed our exact theories of sanitation, but because light, dryness, and moving air visibly changed the feel and smell of textiles. A bed long closed up in a dark, stale room became close and heavy. A bed exposed to fresh air felt restored, even if only partially. One can imagine the sensory difference very easily. The stale sweetness of wool and trapped warmth replaced, for a few hours perhaps, by the sharper scent of open air moving through cloth. Chests played their own role in this defensive system. In many households, valuable textiles were stored in wooden chests not only because chests were secure and practical, but because order itself depended on containment. A linen chest separated washed fabric from the active disorder of the room. It allowed the household to draw a boundary, however fragile, between what was currently in use and what was being preserved for proper use later. To open such a chest and remove a cleaner piece of linen was to restore a small measure of dignity and bodily ease. To find that stored goods had themselves become stale, damp, or troubled by pests was a quiet domestic defeat. Combs belong here too, though they are often thought of only in relation to hair. The medieval comb was an instrument of inspection as much as grooming. It trained the hand to move through fibers, to look closely, to separate strands, to detect what might otherwise remain hidden. A culture that used combs regularly was also, in a broader sense, a culture of scrutiny, a culture familiar with the idea that the body and its coverings needed to be examined. That habit of examination extended beyond hair. Seams, collars, bedding edges, folds in cloth, and the corners of sleeping places were all part of the visual and tactile world of household vigilance. Then there were the floor coverings, the rushes and strewn herbs that appear so often in descriptions of medieval interiors. Fresh rushes could brighten a room, soften the ground, and create a sense of renewal. Herbs added fragrance and, in some cases, were believed to discourage pests or purify the air. Lavender, mint, rosemary, wormwood, and other plants entered domestic practice partly for pleasure, partly for belief, and partly through accumulated observation. It would be naive to imagine these materials forming a perfect insect barrier. They did not, but the act of strewing fresh material underfoot still mattered. Changed smell, changed atmosphere. It signaled that the room had been tended. And in a world where the management of fleas was inseparable from the management of household order, atmosphere itself was a form of action. This is one of the subtler points that competing accounts often miss. Medieval people were not only fighting insects, they were fighting the feeling of drift, the sense that a room had gone stale, that bedding had become overused, that domestic boundaries were slipping. Fleas were one symptom of that slippage, but not the only one. A well-kept chamber was meant to smell fresher, feel drier, appear more orderly, and give the body some chance of relief. The household measures directed at pests therefore also had emotional and symbolic value. They reassured the inhabitants that someone was still governing the space. The chamber pot, humble though it was, belongs to the same domestic story. Modern viewers may think of it only as a reminder of inconvenience, but its presence tells us something about how sleeping space was organized. Nighttime bodily needs had to be managed close to the bed. That meant the bedchamber was not a pure zone of rest separated cleanly from every other function. It was intimate, practical, and sometimes crowded with objects that handled the necessities of the body. The more functions concentrated around the sleeping area, the harder it was to maintain the sharp forms of cleanliness modern people take for granted. The medieval bedchamber was therefore not dirty by negligence alone. It was materially burdened by the fact that so many elements of life converged there. Warming pans add another layer to that picture. In colder climates and wealthier homes, beds might be warmed with metal pans filled with embers and passed between the sheets before sleep. This practice could make a bed far more inviting in winter. Yet here again comfort and complexity moved together. Curtains were drawn, sheets warmed, bodies entered layered textiles, and the whole enclosed system of warmth that made rest possible also made the bed a more concentrated environment. Medieval people were constantly balancing the need for warmth against the need for freshness. Cold could be dangerous, but overly closed rooms and overused bedding created problems of their own. The good chamber was not simply the warm chamber. It was the chamber that achieved a workable compromise. Animal skins and furs complicate the story further. Fur linings, sheepskins, and pelts could provide real insulation and luxury. In some households, they were precious goods. In others, they were practical necessities. Yet anything taken from animal life brought its own maintenance burdens. Furs had to be aired, brushed, stored properly, and protected from damage. They were deeply useful but hardly neutral. Once again, we find the same medieval pattern. The very materials that made life bearable in a cold and often uncomfortable world could also create ideal habitats for small, unwelcome creatures. Laundry, of course, stood at the center of all this. Medieval and early modern washing was hard labor. Water had to be fetched. Fires had to be maintained. Soap or lye preparations had to be made or acquired. Garments were soaked, scrubbed, wrung, pounded, rinsed, and dried according to material and circumstance. Heavy textiles were especially demanding. Weather determined much. Space determined more. A household with access to servants, yards, clean water, and spare cloth possessed a real structural advantage over one without them. This is why cleanliness in the past cannot be discussed as mere there is something revealing in the fact that so much of this work vanished into normalcy. Chronicles rarely praise the person who kept the bedding tolerable. Political records do not linger over the woman who knew which herbs made a chamber feel fresher, or the servant who recognized when old straw had to be replaced, or the laundress whose labor gave a household 2 or 3 nights of relative relief. Yet, without such people, medieval domestic life would have felt markedly harsher. The history of Fleas, in that sense, is a history of uncelebrated incompetence. Sonal virtue. It was labor, infrastructure, and time. That labor fell unevenly. Laundresses carried specialized knowledge about fabric, stains, shrinking, drying, and the handling of linen. Servants in large households knew when bedding had to be aired, when rushes needed changing, when chambers had gone too long without proper attention. Wives and daughters in modest households performed similar work without formal titles. Their expertise was often practical rather than textual, learned by repetition and necessity. And in that repetition, they built the real front line against the everyday burden of fleas. Not a dramatic front line, but a repetitive one. Wash, hang, dry, fold, store, inspect, shake, beat, repeat. This competence extended into architecture as well. The design of a room affected how well it could be governed. Ventilation mattered, though medieval builders did not always have the luxury of optimizing it. Light mattered. Access to hearth heat mattered. The ease with which bedding could be moved or aired mattered. A cramped room with little circulation and many sleepers would almost always be harder to keep comfortable than a larger, better-managed chamber. Over time, as more specialized domestic spaces emerged in wealthier households, sleeping could become somewhat more separated from cooking, work, and storage. That did not abolish pests, but it did begin to redefine what a bedchamber ought to be. Privacy plays an interesting role here. Medieval Europe is often described, rightly, as a world with less privacy than our own. Families shared spaces. Servants slept near masters or in common rooms. Travelers bunked with strangers. Children remained in parental rooms longer. Yet privacy was not absent. It existed in gradations, especially among the wealthy. And where greater privacy appeared, it could support more attentive control of bedding and personal goods. A private chamber could be more carefully supervised, better stored, and less exposed to the constant traffic that carried disorder with it. In that sense, the growth of privacy and the management of fleas were connected by the same larger historical movement toward more bounded interiors. Still, even the best bounded interior remained vulnerable to the outside world. Boots carried dust from streets and yards. Cloaks came in from stables, markets, ships, and inns. Visitors sat on benches, laid down baggage, and slept in guest beds. Dogs scratched at doors. Cats passed under furniture. Children rolled on floors and shared blankets. Servants moved between work areas and sleeping areas. The household was never sealed. And because it was never sealed, its defenses were always provisional. Medieval people did not build a flawless domestic fortress. They maintained a porous habitat under constant pressure. That pressure helps explain why certain rituals became emotionally important. Evening routines, for example, were not only about preparing for sleep. They were about securing a small pocket of order before the night. Clothes were loosened or changed. Bedding was straightened. The fire was arranged. Perhaps the room was checked. Perhaps a child was settled. Perhaps a pet was kept back. Perhaps a coverlet was shaken one last time. These gestures did not guarantee peace, but they marked a threshold between the active disorder of the day and the hoped-for stillness of sleep. When fleas interrupted that stillness, the interruption was felt not just as itching, but as the breakdown of a carefully assembled refuge. Morning routines told the same story in reverse. People rose, opened curtains if they had them, lifted bedding, inspected cloth, and returned sleeping space to daytime order. A good household did not let the bed simply stew in its own warmth hour after hour. It reset the room. And that resetting was one of the key techniques by which people lived with fleas rather than surrendering completely to them. Their goal was rarely total extermination. It was the restoration of manageability. Children must have learned these habits very early. A child in a medieval or early modern household would not have received a theoretical lecture on parasite management, but they would have watched adults air bedding, change rushes, shake blankets, scold them for dirtying stored linen, move animals away from sleeping places, and complain when a chamber had become close or troublesome. Through such observation, children absorbed a whole model of domestic order. They learned that comfort had to be worked for, that sleeping space required care, and that small biting nuisances were part of the world one tried, repeatedly, to push back against. And that phrase, push back against, may be the most accurate description of the entire experience. Medieval Europe did not conquer fleas. It negotiated with them through labor, custom, fabric, architecture, season, and endurance. Some households pushed the burden farther away than others. Some failed more often. Some never had the means to do much at all. But almost all, in one way or another, were engaged in the same quiet contest. The richest irony is that this contest reveals the sophistication of ordinary life far better than many grander subjects do. A crusade or a coronation shows public ambition. The management of bedding shows private intelligence. It shows a civilization attending closely to the body without possessing modern science, creating workable habits without perfect theory, and preserving decency under conditions that never fully cooperated. Fleas become historically interesting, then, not because they are grotesque or amusing, but because they force us to see how much thought, labor, and care went into the simple act of making nighttime bearable. And once nighttime becomes the focus, another question begins to emerge. What did it do to the mind, to mood, to sleep itself, to live in a world where rest could so easily be disturbed by cold, noise, shared space, smoke, insects, and the thousand little bodily frictions of pre-modern life? Because the next layer of this story is not only about household objects or material defenses. It is about the lived psychology of sleep and about how medieval people endured the long nights of a world that could comfort them, shelter them, and trouble them all at once. And about how medieval people endured the long nights of a world that could comfort them, shelter them, and trouble them all at once. This is where the story becomes quieter and, in some ways, more intimate than ever. Fleas were not merely a household problem in the abstract. They were part of the texture of interrupted rest. And sleep in medieval Europe was already a more fragile thing than modern people often realize. Darkness was deeper. Heating was uneven. Night sounds carried differently through timber walls, shutters, courtyards, stables, and streets. Privacy was limited. Beds were shared. Fires burned low. Bodies cooled. Then, on top of all that, something might begin to bite. A modern viewer might think of a flea bite as small, almost trivial, and in isolation it is small. But sleep does not experience irritation in isolation. It experiences it in context. A single bite at the ankle while lying still under a blanket can become disproportionately present because the body has nowhere else to go. A second bite, then a third, or simply the uncertainty that one may come at any moment, can keep the mind half alert. Sleep turns shallow. The hand begins to scratch almost before the mind is fully awake. The blanket is adjusted. A seam is pulled away from the skin. Someone sharing the bed shifts. A child murmurs. The room settles again. Then the irritation returns. Medieval people did not need to leave written psychological studies for us to understand the effect. Any repeated disturbance at night changes the shape of rest. That matters more than it first appears to. In pre-modern life, sleep was not a luxury added onto an otherwise comfortable existence. It was one of the few periods in which the laboring body could restore itself. Agricultural work, household work, craft labor, travel, service, child-rearing, and religious routine all demanded energy. To lose sleep repeatedly, even in small increments, was to carry fatigue forward into the next day's obligations. A peasant woman rising before dawn, a servant expected to move quickly through chores, a monk called to prayer in the night, a cart driver leaving early, all of them lived close to the margins of tiredness already. Fleas did not create that world, but they made it harder. Night also changes the emotional scale of discomfort. A nuisance in daylight can be brushed aside, literally and mentally. At night, in stillness, the same nuisance feels larger. Medieval nights were not silent, but they were often darker, slower, and more enclosing than our own. Without artificial light readily available for every interruption, the body was forced to negotiate discomfort within partial darkness. One might sit up, feel through bedding, grope at the edge of the mattress, shake a cloth, or move closer to the hearth if it still held warmth. But none of these actions provided certainty. Often the person could only settle back down and hope the bites would stop, knowing they very well might not. That uncertainty produced a particular mental habit: anticipatory vigilance. When people live with recurring discomfort, they begin to brace for it before it happens. The bed is approached with caution as well as relief. The blanket is trusted, but not entirely. The body begins to read small sensations suspiciously. Was that simply a fold in the linen, or the beginning of another bite? Did the child stir from dreaming, or from itching? Is the room too warm, too close, too stale? The more familiar the nuisance, the more it enters expectation. This is one of the most interesting psychological truths of the subject. Fleas affected not only the body's rest, but the mind's confidence in rest. Children would have inhabited this reality in a particularly revealing way. For them, bedtime already meant surrendering to darkness, to dependence, to the unknown noises of the house. Add itching skin, shared blankets, and the possibility of repeated bites, and sleep becomes a negotiation between comfort and irritation. A small child may not distinguish clearly between one source of nighttime misery and another. Cold, fear, closeness, dampness, and insect bites can blend into a general sense that night is not entirely kind. Parents and caretakers, in turn, must have carried the tired sympathy familiar to all ages. The effort to settle a child who cannot quite rest, the checking of bedding by touch, the promise that it will be better once the blankets are shaken or the shirt changed. Old age likely altered the experience as well. An elderly body is often more sensitive to broken sleep, to skin irritation, to the stiffness that comes from waking and shifting repeatedly in the night. In a world without easy heating and with less cushioning from abundant bedding for many people, the old already faced nights as a physical challenge. Fleas added a layer of petty cruelty to that challenge. Not dramatic cruelty, not the sort that enters heroic narrative, but the kind that wears at patience and comfort in the final hours before dawn. There is also the social dimension of shared sleep. Medieval Europe was not a world in which every individual routinely possessed a private bedroom and an untouched mattress. Many people slept beside spouses, siblings, children, servants, fellow travelers, or companions of necessity. Shared sleeping could be warm, economical, and emotionally reassuring. It could also complicate nighttime discomfort in ways both practical and psychological. One person scratching wakes another. One restless body disturbs the whole bed. One child's bites become everyone's problem. If someone rose to shake bedding or check a garment, that movement might wake the others as well. In such environments, fleas were rarely a solitary annoyance. They were part of the social life of exhaustion. This shared exhaustion could shape tempers. The medieval household, like any household, was not governed by pure patience. Tired people grow irritable. A servant blamed for insufficient airing of bedding, a child accused of bringing a dog too close to the bed, a spouse complaining about a room left close and stale. All of these small tensions belong to the likely emotional weather of domestic life. They are rarely recorded because they are ordinary. But ordinary history is often where truth lives. Fleas may have helped spark the kind of nightly friction that left no formal trace and yet formed part of the actual soundscape of family life. Monastic settings present another fascinating variation. In monasteries and convents, sleep was often structured by rule. The night was not simply personal time. It could be interrupted by prayer offices, bells, and communal discipline. This meant that the body's rest was already segmented. In such a setting, the irritation of fleas may have been felt not only as physical discomfort, but as one more test of concentration and endurance in a life organized around spiritual order. A monk lying awake after being bitten was not merely losing sleep. He was also preparing to rise for prayer, chant, silence, and duty. And here again we find that medieval people did not necessarily imagine comfort as something they were owed without interruption. Their religious and moral culture often encouraged acceptance of bodily hardship up to a point. Yet acceptance is not the same as indifference. A monk might endure discomfort more patiently than a merchant in an inn, but he still endured discomfort. Fleas make visible the distance between idealized spiritual language and the stubborn facts of embodied life. They turn abstraction back into skin. Dream life, too, may have been affected in ways we can only partly recover. Sleep broken by repeated irritation tends to produce lighter, stranger, more fragmented dreams. Medieval people lived in a symbolic world where dreams could carry meaning, warning, fear, or reflection. A poor night might therefore have consequences beyond mere tiredness. The line between bodily discomfort and mental disturbance was never absolute. A restless sleeper was not simply a rested person minus a few hours. He or she might also wake more anxious, more irritable, more vulnerable to fear, more susceptible to the moral or spiritual interpretations attached to troubled sleep. Then there is the question of noise. Fleas themselves are silent, but the response to them is not. Scratching, shifting straw, rustling linen, muttered complaint, the slap of a hand against skin, the movement of someone sitting up and lying down again, all contribute to the minute sounds of disturbed rest. In a shared room, these sounds mattered. One person's discomfort could subtly spread through the sleeping group, producing a collective restlessness. Medieval sleep was therefore not only a physiological state. It was a social condition, fragile and mutually dependent. The presence of fleas magnified that fragility. The seasons intensified these effects in different ways. In summer, the body might already be too warm under its blankets, the air heavier, the room less tolerable. Fleas in such conditions could push a person toward repeated waking and a feeling of sticky exhaustion by morning. In winter, by contrast, the misery lay in the fact that response required exposing oneself to cold. To shake bedding, adjust clothing, or rise from a warmed place in the middle of the night was no small thing when the chamber air bit at the skin. So the sleeper faced a miserable calculation: endure the itching or lose warmth in attempting to manage it. The answer would vary, but the dilemma itself tells us much about the texture of pre-modern rest. This may be one reason why fresh bedding and fresh linen could feel so emotionally significant. They did more than improve cleanliness. They restored hope for a decent night. After a long day, to slide into cleaner cloth and better-aired blankets must have offered not just physical relief, but a form of quiet optimism. Perhaps tonight would be easier. Perhaps the bed would feel cooler, softer, less troublesome. Perhaps the child would sleep through. Perhaps the guest would not notice. The deep value of domestic labor lies partly in this emotional economy of anticipated relief. There is a revealing parallel here with candlelight. A candle does not abolish the night, but it creates a small circle within it where human order can persist. Fresh bedding worked in much the same way. It did not abolish insects, cold, or shared vulnerability, but it created, for a while, a more habitable pocket inside those larger conditions. This is why the work of laundering, shaking, airing, and arranging was not trivial maintenance. It was the creation of temporary sanctuary. Sleep patterns themselves may also have made people more aware of nocturnal discomfort than modern assumptions allow. Historians have long discussed the likelihood that many pre-modern people experienced segmented sleep, especially in certain times and places, with a first sleep and second sleep separated by a period of waking in the night. Whether this pattern was universal is debated, but the broader point remains useful. Medieval sleep could be more interrupted and less idealized as a single unbroken block than modern culture often imagines. In such a world, fleas did not necessarily destroy an otherwise perfect expectation of continuous rest. Instead, they inserted themselves into a sleep culture already shaped by waking, prayer, conversation, tending the fire, checking animals, or responding to bodily needs. That did not make them insignificant. It meant they became part of an already complex nighttime rhythm. And yet, even within that rhythm, the desire for uninterrupted, peaceful sleep was real. It had to be. Restful sleep is one of the most basic human pleasures, and medieval people were no less capable of cherishing it than we are. The joy of lying down in winter under warm coverings, the relief of a quiet chamber after a day of labor, the comfort of a familiar bed after travel, these things mattered deeply. Fleas become historically powerful precisely because they intruded upon something cherished. They were not merely one more hardship among 100 identical hardships. They were the small corruption of one of life's most needed comforts. Travelers must have felt this with particular force. After long hours on horseback or on foot, after rain, mud, bargaining, delay, and uncertainty, the promise of an in bed would have carried enormous emotional weight. To reach such a bed and find it alive with irritation was not just physically unpleasant. It was the collapse of expected relief. This is perhaps why literary and anecdotal references to bad lodgings often feel sharper than references to many other inconveniences. Poor meal disappoints. A poor bed wounds the spirit of travel more directly, because it takes aim at the hour when the body hopes to recover. One might even say that fleas transform time. A difficult day ends. Evening suggests closure. One prepares to rest. But if sleep is repeatedly disturbed, the day's fatigue is not contained where it should be. It spills forward. Morning arrives before restoration is complete. Medieval life, already so dependent on daylight and bodily effort, was acutely vulnerable to that spillover. The person who slept poorly could not simply compensate with a late morning under soft electric light. Labor waited. Prayer waited. Markets opened. Animals needed tending. Bread had to be baked. Fields had to be entered. Rest, once lost, was rarely replaced. There is a deeper trust-building lesson in this for us as viewers, because it reveals why tiny details matter in serious history. We often study the past through laws, battles, dynasties, and disasters. But the true weight of a civilization is also carried in how people slept, how often they woke, what made them scratch in the dark, and how much effort it took to prepare a bed that offered more comfort than trouble. That is not minor history. It is history at the level where institutions enter the body. And perhaps the most human detail of all is that people kept hoping for better nights. They continued to shake the blankets, replace straw, air linen, warm the bed, hush the children, bring in herbs, and prepare the chamber as carefully as circumstances allowed. Hope in domestic life rarely announces itself grandly. Often it looks like routine. It looks like someone making the bed properly because maybe tonight will be more peaceful than last night. That hopeful routine takes us naturally into another part of the story, because once we begin to ask how people judged a good bed from a bad one, and a respectable chamber from a shameful one, we move from the psychology of sleep into the social language of comfort itself, into the standards by which medieval Europeans measured decency, hospitality, and the quiet success or failure of a household after dark. Into the standards by which medieval Europeans measured decency, hospitality, and the quiet success or failure of a household after dark. This is where fleas become more than a nuisance and more than a medical curiosity. They become part of a social language. A bed was never only a bed. It was a statement about the house, the people who governed it, the resources they possessed, and the seriousness with which they took the duties of daily life. To offer a clean, well-prepared sleeping place was to say something about one's place in the world. To fail at that task, especially in a visible or memorable way, could leave a mark far beyond one bad night. Hospitality carried great moral weight in medieval Europe. Scripture, custom, rank, kinship, and simple necessity all reinforced the idea that travelers, guests, dependents, and sometimes even strangers should be received with a degree of care. What that care looked like varied enormously. A peasant cottage could not offer what a monastery guest hall or a noble manor could offer. But within every setting there were expectations shaped by means and status. Warmth, food, and a place to sleep formed the basic grammar of welcome. And because sleep was so central to the experience of being received, the bedchamber often became the place where hospitality was either quietly confirmed or quietly undermined. It is easy to imagine how sensitive this could be. A guest may speak politely at supper, admire the household, and express gratitude for shelter. But what he remembers in the morning may be the bed. Was it cold, damp, stale, overused, shared unwillingly, or persistently biting? A householder might not be judged harshly for every minor discomfort, since everyone knew travel and lodging were uncertain things. Still, there was a threshold, A bed that was obviously neglected or infested did not simply reveal bad luck. It suggested poor governance. The same was true for inns, where reputation depended heavily on whether a traveler believed he would be able to rest. That is why the social meaning of a flea bite could exceed its physical size. One bite might be dismissed. Many bites, or the evident presence of pests in bedding, could imply that no one had properly aired the sheets, checked the mattress, changed the rushes, or kept animals and sleeping spaces under sufficient control. The problem was not just the insect. The problem was what the insect seemed to say about household competence. In this sense, fleas participated in a moral economy. They became small witnesses to domestic order or domestic failure. The richer the household, the higher the expectation. In a great house, there were servants, stores of linen, designated chambers, and a hierarchy of responsibility. A guest placed in a chamber that felt stale or troublesome was not merely encountering hardship. He was encountering a lapse in a system that should, in theory, have prevented that hardship. This did not mean elite households always succeeded. Far from it. Large houses were difficult to manage precisely because they were large, full of movement, layered fabrics, animals, visitors, and complex routines. But the expectation of success remained, and with it the embarrassment of visible failure. That embarrassment could be especially sharp for women responsible for the chamber and the bed. In aristocratic and prosperous households, the mistress of the house might delegate actual labor to servants, laundresses, chamberers, and maids, yet the broader condition of the domestic interior still reflected on her oversight. In middling homes, where fewer hands were available, the link between female labor and household reputation could be even more direct. The bed a guest slept in, the freshness of the linen, the order of the room, the smell of the chamber, and the presence or absence of biting pests all folded back into judgments about diligence, care, and respectability. The history of fleas is therefore also a history of scrutiny, often gendered, often silent, and often unfairly concentrated on those responsible for holding domestic life together. The innkeeper faced a similar burden, though in a more commercial form. Inns were not homes in the full familial sense, but they were judged according to many of the same standards. A good inn offered more than shelter from the weather. It offered a temporary promise of order. The traveler entering at dusk wanted food, a fire, perhaps a stable for the horse, and above all some chance at sleep. The innkeeper who failed repeatedly in that final task risked more than complaint. He risked reputation. Word of mouth mattered. Merchants, clerics, messengers, and pilgrims carried judgments from place to place. A bad bed could travel farther than the room itself. Yet inns also show us how complex fairness could be. An innkeeper might be blamed for troubles he could not fully prevent. Every traveler brought baggage, clothing, animals, dust, and biological passengers from elsewhere. Bedding turned over constantly. Rooms were shared. Resources for laundering and replacement were limited, especially on busy routes. So the standard of hospitality lived in tension with the practical impossibility of perfect control. That tension is one of the central truths of this whole subject. Medieval people judged domestic order seriously, but they also lived in material conditions that made the maintenance of order perpetually fragile. This is why decency mattered more than perfection. A respectable chamber did not need to feel modern. It needed to feel tended. A good bed did not need to be sterile. It needed to feel prepared, aired, and cared for. A guest could forgive narrow space, simple furnishings, even some roughness, if the place showed signs of conscientious management. The same principle applied within families. A modest home could still be respectable if bedding was handled as carefully as means allowed. Respectability, in other words, was often measured in effort rather than total success. That effort could be read materially. Fresh rushes underfoot suggested attention. Well-folded linen suggested discipline. A room not overwhelmed by stale smells suggested recent airing or cleaning. Curtains drawn back in the day, bedding lifted, garments hung rather than dropped. All these small signs communicated that someone was trying to keep disorder at bay. Fleas were harder to read directly because they hid, but when they made themselves known, they altered the meaning of all those visible signs. They asked, in effect, whether appearance and reality matched. This may help explain why certain domestic virtues were so often praised in moral and practical literature. Cleanliness, thrift, moderation, vigilance, and diligence were not abstract ideals floating above daily life. They were necessary habits in a world where objects decayed, pests persisted, and comfort could be lost quickly through neglect. A careless householder did not merely create aesthetic disorder. He or she made bodily life harder. Fleas, like other domestic nuisances, were among the forces constantly testing whether good order had substance behind it. There is also an interesting class dynamic in how such standards were imagined. The elite could turn comfort into display. Rich bed hangings, embroidered coverlets, feather mattresses, and stores of linen allowed luxury itself to become a form of prestige. But luxury created visibility. It invited comparison. If a great household could furnish elaborate chambers yet still expose guests to obvious pest trouble, the contrast might be sharper than in a poorer setting where expectations were lower. Meanwhile, poorer households, though judged against humbler standards, could earn admiration for neatness, ingenuity, and care despite having almost nothing to work with. This is another useful correction to simple assumptions. Comfort was not identical with virtue, and poverty was not identical with disorder. Fleas crossed those boundaries more easily than social theory liked to admit. Still, social language often disguised structural inequality by framing hardship as personal failure. If a poor family's bedding was old, worn, and difficult to cleanse, outsiders might read that as neglect when it was really scarcity. If an overworked woman could not keep up with laundering, airing, childcare, and food preparation all at once, the signs of fatigue in the household might be judged morally. The presence of fleas could therefore become one more way society interpreted poverty through the lens of discipline rather than resources. That pattern, uncomfortable as it is, feels surprisingly familiar across centuries. Religious institutions had their own standards. Monasteries, convents, hospitals, and guest houses were meant to embody order of a particular kind. Their bedding might be simpler than noble luxury, but simplicity itself could become a moral sign. Cleanliness in such places was not merely pleasant. It expressed discipline, charity, and respect for the body as something entrusted to care even within an ascetic framework. A neglected dormitory or filthy guest bed did not simply offend comfort. It threatened the moral self-image of the institution. Yet, as with households and inns, the material challenge was real. Shared space, large numbers, limited means, and the constant needs of the sick or poor made perfect management impossible. The ideal remained higher than the attainable point. One of the most revealing aspects of this entire story is how often bodily comfort served as a quiet test of social truthfulness. A great lord could appear magnificent in hall, richly dressed and well served. But if the guest chamber was troublesome, some of that magnificence rang hollow. A pious institution could preach charity, but if the poor were left on foul bedding, the preaching lost force. A respectable family could present itself well in public, yet a badly tended sleeping room might reveal strain, disorder, or simple overextension behind the facade. Fleas, tiny and unintended, could puncture appearances with embarrassing efficiency. Children's upbringing also belonged to this language of decency. To raise children in a well-run home meant teaching them not only manners in public but habits in private. Where to place garments, how to preserve bedding, how not to dirty stored linen, how to behave in shared sleeping arrangements, how to understand that comfort required cooperation. Children who rolled through the house carelessly or brought animals too close to sleeping places were not just being childish. They were threatening the labor that kept the domestic world habitable. So the management of fleas intersected with moral education. It helped teach that order did not happen by itself. Marriage, too, can be glimpsed through this lens. A spouse entering a new household, especially a bride, entered not merely a set of relationships but a material regime. What sort of beds were used? How often was linen changed? Were animals kept close? Was the chamber aired? Did servants do their work properly? Such details would influence marital comfort in ways unrecorded but profound. Domestic compatibility was not only about affection or conflict. It was also about whether two people could live inside the same standards of bodily care and household expectation. Fleas, by intruding at night, turned those standards into unavoidable realities. There is another subtle reversal here. We often think of luxury as the opposite of hardship, but in historical experience, luxury also sharpened awareness of hardship. A person accustomed to coarse bedding might tolerate a degree of discomfort that a more pampered sleeper found intolerable. Once a household had known the pleasures of good linen, well-aired chambers, and carefully managed beds, the return of fleas could feel more scandalous than it would in a world of universal roughness. Improvement raises the emotional cost of decline. So the spread of more refined domestic standards may actually have made people more sensitive to the very discomforts they were trying to reduce. That sensitivity likely shaped complaint, memory, and conversation. Guests might speak tactfully, but they remembered. Servants heard criticism. Wives noticed remarks. Travelers compared one inn to another. Monks compared one house of the order to another. Such informal judgments formed a hidden archive of domestic reputation. Most of it is lost to us, yet it surely existed. And because it existed, beds were prepared with more than sleep in mind. They were prepared with honor in mind. Honor is perhaps not a word modern viewers instinctively connect to fleas, but that is exactly why the subject is so instructive. In medieval Europe, honor did not live only in battles, oaths, and heraldry. It lived in the ability to keep a house, receive a guest, manage dependents, and preserve dignity in the smallest routines of life. A bed infested with biting pests could offend honor because it failed in hospitality, in stewardship, and in respect for the bodies entrusted to the household. The insect itself was tiny. The social meaning could be disproportionately large. This is also why household remedies and defensive practices persisted so stubbornly. Herbs were strewn not only because someone hoped they might help physically, but because doing something was part of being a competent guardian of the home. Bedding was aired not only because air could freshen cloth, but because a good household aired bedding. Floors were renewed because they should be renewed. In other words, anti-flea practice was partly practical and partly ceremonial, though not ceremonial in the empty sense. It was ritualized competence, repeated because order had to be seen as well as pursued. The more closely we look, the more the chamber seems like a stage where social values became material. Neatness, hierarchy, modesty, hospitality, thrift, labor, even affection all became visible in the arrangement of cloth and the quality of rest people were offered. Fleas disrupted that stage performance in a uniquely intimate way. They were not like a broken chair or a cracked cup. They reached the skin. They turned social evaluation into bodily sensation. A bad room could be felt literally through the night. And yet, as always, the story should not harden into simple moral drama. Many excellent householders lived under impossible pressures. Weather ruined drying. Travel brought new infestations. Poverty limited replacement. War displaced families. Illness weakened labor. A good woman, a conscientious servant, an experienced innkeeper, or a disciplined monastic house could all lose ground temporarily against conditions they did not create. Medieval people knew this. They could judge, but they also understood misfortune. The standards of decency mattered precisely because they were pursued in the face of difficulty, not in its absence. That human balance between judgment and sympathy is worth keeping in mind as we move deeper. The medieval world was full of people trying to appear respectable and people trying simply to get by, often being the same people at different moments in their lives. Fleas passed among them all, turning private effort into private frustration and occasionally into public embarrassment. Through that tiny channel, we can see how closely comfort, morality, labor, and status were bound together. And once comfort becomes social language, the next question begins to open almost by itself. If a good chamber, a decent bed, and a well-governed household carried so much moral and emotional weight, what happened when the wider pressures of medieval life, war, famine, displacement, climate, and sheer instability, began to overwhelm the careful domestic routines that kept such standards even partly alive? Because that is where fleas stop being merely a problem of ordinary housekeeping and begin to reveal, with unusual clarity, how fragile household order really was when history pressed in from outside. Because that is where fleas stop being merely a problem of ordinary housekeeping and begin to reveal, with unusual clarity, how fragile household order really was when history pressed in from outside. A household might be diligent, respectable, and deeply practiced in the arts of keeping beds tolerable, linen managed, and sleeping space as decent as circumstances allowed. But medieval life was never lived in a sealed domestic shell. Harvests failed. Armies moved. Prices rose. Weather turned cold or wet for too long. Disease returned. Families were uprooted. Servants vanished. Animals had to be brought closer. Bedding wore out faster than it could be replaced. And under those pressures, the small defenses of ordinary life began to fray. This is one of the final and most revealing truths of the whole subject. Fleas were not simply a sign of filth in some crude sense. Very often they were a sign of strain. They exposed what happened when labor outran the body, when resources ran thin, when too many people shared too little space, or when the routines that made a room habitable could no longer be maintained. A blanket not aired was sometimes neglect, but just as often exhaustion. Old straw left too long was sometimes carelessness, but just as often scarcity. A crowded sleeping place was not always poor judgment. Sometimes it was winter. Sometimes it was displacement. Sometimes it was survival. And that is why living with fleas in medieval Europe tells us so much more than one might expect from the title alone. It reveals a civilization in close contact with the material world, a civilization that cared deeply about bodily comfort without ever fully controlling it. It reveals households built on discipline, repetition, hidden labor, and compromise. It reveals how social rank shaped comfort, but never completely protected anyone from the smallest intrusions of nature. It reveals how the bed, that most ordinary object, could become a meeting point for class, gender, illness, hospitality, fatigue, and quiet domestic hope. It also reminds us to be careful with our assumptions. Medieval people were not unaware of discomfort. They were not indifferent to cleanliness. They were not all living in the same conditions, nor all thinking in the same ways. They aired bedding, changed linen, used herbs, beat textiles, managed animals, judged rooms by smell and freshness, worried about guests, and tried, continually, to make nighttime more bearable. They did not solve the problem because the world they lived in made total solutions almost impossible. But they noticed, they adapted, they worked, and that work deserves to be taken seriously. If anything, the story becomes more human the smaller it gets. We can imagine the grand cathedrals, the stone castles, the market squares and monasteries of medieval Europe. But now perhaps we can also imagine the other side of that world. the hand reaching in the dark to scratch at an ankle, the blanket lifted and shaken before bed, the relief of fresh linen, the embarrassment of a guest chamber not quite as decent as one hoped, the tired mother checking a child's skin, the servant airing bedding in thin winter light, the traveler lying down at last, grateful for shelter and quietly uncertain about the night ahead. Those details matter because history is not only what people built, fought, ruled, or believed. It is also what they endured repeatedly without grandeur. Some of the most revealing facts about a society are hidden in the discomforts it considered ordinary. Fleas were ordinary. That is precisely why they matter. They force us to see the medieval world not as a pageant of kings and plagues alone, but as a lived environment made of cloth, wood, smoke, animals, bodies, seasons, and constant small negotiations with inconvenience. And perhaps that is the lasting takeaway from this long, quiet journey through a subject most people would normally ignore. Medieval Europe was not just harder than the modern world. It was closer to the body, closer to animals, closer to weather, closer to fabric, closer to the consequences of every missed chore and every exhausted evening. To live with fleas in that world was to live in daily contact with the limits of comfort. But it was also to live inside a culture that kept trying, through care and habit and persistence, to make life gentler where it could. That persistence is what stays with me most. Not the insect itself, but the effort against it. The effort to prepare the bed properly. The effort to preserve a child's sleep. The effort to receive a guest decently. The effort to hold together some sense of order after dark in a world that never made comfort easy. It is a small story, and a very large one at the same time. If you've stayed with me through this one, I'd genuinely love to know what part struck you most. Was it the roll of linen, the shared experience of sleep, the connection to plague, or simply the realization that something as small as a flea can open a window into the entire structure of medieval daily life? And as always, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and what history subject you'd like us to explore in a future deep dive. If this kind of calm, thoughtful long-form history is exactly what you like to listen to in the evening, do subscribe to Boring History Documentary. And if you enjoyed this journey into the overlooked side of the medieval world, a like on the video is a simple way to support more careful, quiet history here on the channel. For now, thank you for spending this time with me, and until next time, good night.